Guys, this is the kind of story that looks like a classic Cinderella setup for 5 seconds, and then turns into a full-blown Mafia emotional train wreck. Everyone at that luxury penthouse party thought the girl in the plain blue dress was just background noise, someone who walked in by mistake and would disappear without anyone noticing. But the one man who noticed her immediately was Dominic Caruso, the most feared man in the room. And here's the twist. He didn't stop her because she was beautiful. He stopped her because she was the woman who once saved his mother's life. That's where everything flips. What starts as a soft, unexpected connection turns into a dangerous relationship between a struggling nursing student and a man sitting on top of New York's criminal empire. And the deeper it goes, the more insane it gets, because when a mafia boss falls in love, it's never just romance. It comes with enemies, blood, obsession, and a war that can destroy everyone around them.
All right, check this scene. We're in some ridiculous Manhattan penthouse. Chandeliers are bleeding light everywhere, and over on the sidelines is Clara Bennett, basically playing wallpaper. For 45 minutes, she's been clutching the same sad glass of sparkling water, watching these social X-rays move around her like she's a piece of pricey furniture. Okay, so rewind 3 weeks. A sketchy invite materializes under her door. No return address, just her name in fancy script promising a night that'll change everything. Yeah, right. Clara is a nursing student, pulling doubles at a diner to survive. She has no business being here, surrounded by women in designer armor and men wearing her tuition on their wrists. But the mystery mail was persistent, showing up 2 more times, so curiosity finally dragged her here. Now, instant regret. She smooths out her thrift store dress, a navy number she altered herself. It's simple, it's clean, but in a room full of couture and carrots, she feels like a pigeon that crashed a peacock convention. Some woman in red silk plows right past. No glance, nearly soaking Clara's sleeve in champagne. Not even a sorry, just a cackle aimed at someone more important. That's the last straw. Clara dumps her glass on a tray. She's out. Whatever this night was supposed to be, it wasn't for her. Maybe it was a simple mix-up, a wrong name for someone who actually fit in this universe. She starts the long walk toward the exit, weaving through chattering groups that part like she's not even there. The giant oak doors look a million miles away. But here's the twist, guys. What she doesn't know is that one person has been watching her since she walked in. Up on the mezzanine, half swallowed by shadows, is Dominic Caruso. His eyes are locked on the girl in blue. He spotted her right away, not for her looks, though she has a real quiet beauty the plastic dolls below can't touch, but for her stillness. In a room full of actors, she was the only one not putting on a show. For almost an hour, he's watched her stand alone, taking in how she observes instead of participating, catching the tiny flinch in her shoulders every time she's ignored. He sees her heading for the door now, chin held high, refusing to show she's been beaten, and Dominic is not a guy who does things on a whim. His entire empire was built on cold, hard strategy and knowing when to stay quiet. But something about this girl makes him want to torch his own rulebook. He comes down the stairs. Clara is inches from freedom when a voice cuts her off. "Leaving so soon!" She spins around to face a man built like a monument, with a face that looks like it was carved from granite. His eyes have the color and intensity of a gathering storm, and they steal her breath. "I don't think I'll be missed," she says, shocked at how steady her own voice is. You can see something flicker in his face. Maybe amusement, maybe something else. "I noticed." And that just shuts Clara down. The party noise fades to static. She can feel the space between them like a current. "I shouldn't have come," she admits quietly. "I don't belong here." He just tilts his head, his gaze so intense it feels like a physical touch. "And yet, here you are, in my home." That takes a second to land, and when it does, the floor tilts. "Your home?" "Dominic Caruso," he says, holding out a hand. I'm your host for the evening." Clara just stares at his hand. This is him? The mystery man everyone's been whispering about with a mix of awe and flat-out fear. She'd pictured some corporate shark, a Wall Street kingpin, but the way people spoke his name, the careful respect in their tones, hinted at something much darker. She takes his hand. His grip is firm, gentle, and lasts just a hair too long. "Clara Ara Bennett, I know who you are." Her heart stumbles. "How?" "I sent the invitation." The words hang in the air, heavy as lead. Clara pulls her hand away, her thoughts scrambling. "Why? We've never met. I'm nobody." And for a split second, a look of pure pain crosses his face. "You're not nobody. You're the woman who saved my mother's life." Clara is just blinking, totally lost. 6 months ago, Bellevue Hospital. An elderly woman was admitted with a heart condition. The doctors gave up on her, but some nursing student refused to quit, stayed all night, held her hand, and talked to her until she was stable. The memory slowly swims into focus. Mrs. Romano, the frail woman with kind eyes who gripped her hand and prayed in Italian. "That was your mother." "That was my mother," he confirms. "She talks about you all the time. She calls you her angel in blue." And right on cue, Clara feels her eyes welling up. She'd often wondered what happened to Mrs. Romano, had wondered if she was still out there fighting. "I was just doing my job." "No." Dominic's voice is soft but absolute. "You did so much more. You gave her hope when there was none. You gave her a reason to breathe." Clara doesn't know what to say. She never thought she'd see any of those patients again. "I wanted to thank you," Dominic says, "to give you one night of beauty." He gestures at the soulless, glittering party behind them. "But I see now this world is cruel to people who actually deserve kindness." For the first time, Clara sees the raw contempt in his eyes. "These people," he says quietly, "they only see status. They looked at you and saw nothing, because that's what they are." She should be offended for them, but instead a warmth spreads through her chest. "I should still leave," she says, but the words lack conviction. "Stay." And it's not a command. Coming from this man radiating pure power, it's a vulnerable request. "Why?" "Because I want to get to know you, Clara Ara Bennett. The person, not just the angel." And in that moment, she's standing between her old life and a new one, and she makes a choice that will detonate everything. She has no clue that Dominic Caruso is one of New York's most dangerous criminal kingpins. She doesn't know his empire runs from the docks to the boardrooms. She doesn't realize that staying tonight will drag her into a vortex of danger and devotion she couldn't possibly imagine. All she knows is that for the first time all night, someone is looking at her like she actually matters. 1 hour, she says. Dominic's smile completely changes his face, making him look almost boyish. 1 hour. Let me show you my home properly without the vultures. He offers his arm and she takes it, letting him lead her away from the party. His private quarters are a world away from the flashy ballroom. This space is warm, lived in, lined with bookshelves and soft golden light. Clara sees photos on a table. A younger Dominic with his mom, an older man who must be his father, and a little girl with a wild, gap-toothed smile. "My niece," Dominic says, noticing her gaze. "Isabella. She's 7 and is thoroughly convinced she's the boss of this family." Clara laughs, and the sound surprises even her. "She sounds wonderful." "She is. She's also the reason I do what I do." He leaves that hanging, moving to a bar to pour 2 amber liquids. "Water is fine for me," she says. It's non-alcoholic apple cider. I don't drink. He passes her the glass, and their fingers brush, sending a jolt through her. They sit in armchairs by a huge window overlooking the city lights. For a while, they just sit in a silence that feels surprisingly easy. "Tell me about yourself," Dominic finally says. "Not your job. Who are you?" No one had ever asked her that. And so she starts talking, really talking, for the first time in years. She tells him about growing up small-town Ohio, about losing her parents in a wreck when she was 16, about the aunt who took her in and pushed her to follow her dream. She talks about coming to New York with nothing but a suitcase, about the grind of surviving in a city that eats people alive, and the nights she cried herself to sleep, sure she had made a huge mistake. The whole time, Dominic just listens, his focus absolute. When she's done, he's quiet for a moment. "You've known pain," he says. "Real pain, the kind that reshapes you. Everyone has pain. Not everyone carries it with such grace." Clara looks down, embarrassed by the compliment. "I don't feel graceful. Most days I feel like I'm just holding on." And then he hits her with it. "That is what grace is. Holding on when everything inside you wants to let go." Her gaze met his, and what she saw wasn't what she'd braced for. It was a shared history, the silent nod between two people who'd survived something. "Your story," she demanded. "Who are you?" "Dominic Caruso." A smile formed, but his eyes stayed cold. "That is one complicated answer. I've got time." He measured her with his eyes, as if guessing how much of his world she could take. "I am someone born into a life I never asked for. A life of duties and debts most can't even fathom. I've done things that make me sick to protect the ones I love. And I've spent my whole life since trying to build something clean, something that could let my people live without looking over their shoulders." It wasn't the full story. Clara felt that in her gut, but it was more honesty than he likely gave anyone. "That must be lonely," she offered. Surprise flickered across Dominic's face. "More than I ever admitted, until right now." An hour vanished without them even noticing. They spoke of books and songs, of broken dreams, and the tiny things that made it all worthwhile. Clara found herself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in ages, leaning in so she wouldn't miss a word. When the clock chimed midnight, a real sting of disappointment hit her. "I should get going." Dominic agreed, but his whole body screamed that he didn't want her to. "Let my driver take you. It's not necessary. Please. It'll put my mind at ease." Clara paused, then gave in. She'd learned to take kindness where she could find it, even if it chafed her pride. Dominic led her to a private elevator, his hand a breath away from her back. At the door, he hesitated. "I need to see you again, Clara Bennett." "Why? Because for the first time in I don't know how long, I wasn't a king with his court. I was just a man talking to a woman who actually saw me. That's a rarer thing than you can imagine." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every alarm bell she had was screaming that this was a bad idea, that men like Dominic Caruso leave wreckage in their wake. But another voice, the one that was sick of playing it safe and having nothing, whispered that safety was overrated. "I'm at the Starlight Diner on Atlantic," she heard herself say. "Tuesday and Thursday afternoons." A real smile finally lit up Dominic's eyes. "I'll see you Tuesday, Clara." She got into the elevator, and as the doors slid shut, she saw him standing there in the golden light, his expression unreadable. The ride home was a total haze. Clara just stared out the window of the luxury car at the passing city lights, her thoughts racing. She'd walked into a party as a nobody and walked out with the attention of the most powerful man there. She had no idea what it meant or where this was going, but as the car stopped at her rundown Brooklyn building, Clara felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. A chance. Now, check if you're already subscribed to our channel. These tales of unexpected meetings and fresh starts are why we're all here. If you're a believer in fate and want to see where Clara's story goes, subscribe and become part of the family. Your support is everything, and we'll see this through together. That next Tuesday came with that perfect, crisp autumn air that almost makes New York feel friendly. Clara had spent the days since the party in a fog, replaying her talk with Dominic so many times it felt fake. Did that actually happen? Did a man from that world really look at her with that kind of raw interest? By the time her apron was on at the Starlight Diner, she'd decided he wasn't coming. Guys like Dominic Caruso don't do Brooklyn diners. They don't chase waitresses who are also nursing students. The whole night was just a beautiful, impossible dream. She buried herself in the work, taking orders like a machine, refilling coffee, and smiling at the regulars who'd become her makeshift family over the past 2 years. The lunch crowd thinned out, and with each passing hour, that hopeful tension in her chest fizzled into acceptance. At 3:15, the bell on the door jingled. Clara glanced up from the counter, and her entire world screeched to a halt. Dominic was standing there, looking like a god in a tailored suit, and the entire diner went dead silent as every single person turned to stare. But Dominic didn't seem to notice the audience. His eyes found Clara instantly, and he gave her that rare, disarming smile. "I believe you mentioned you work Tuesdays," he said, walking to the counter. Clara could vaguely feel her co-worker Maria's jaw hanging open beside her and see old Mr. Patterson almost fumbling his mug as a stunned silence fell over the usually noisy diner. "I didn't think you'd actually show. I always keep my promises." He took a seat at the counter, perfectly relaxed under everyone's gaze. "What's good here?" Clara grabbed for her notepad. "The grilled cheese is decent and the apple pie is made from scratch. I'll have one of each." She went to put in the order, her hands shaking. When she turned back, Dominic was watching her with that same intense gaze from the party. "You seem different here," he noted. "Is it the uniform instead of the gown?" "No. It's that you look like you belong here, confident, totally at home." A warmth bloomed in Clara's chest. "I do belong. This place, these people, they were there for me when I had nobody. The owner, Mrs. Kim, she gave me a shot when I was at rock bottom. Then I owe Mrs. Kim my thanks. She is going to have a stroke when she sees who's sitting at her counter." Dominic actually laughed, a real sound that made even more heads turn. Clara saw that the man who inspired fear in that other world could also just sit here at a diner counter and laugh like a normal person. Over the next hour, squeezed between serving tables and pouring drinks, Clara managed to talk with Dominic. He asked about her classes, her patience, what she wanted out of life. He wanted to know her favorite books and movies, the songs she turned to for comfort. And he listened to her answers as if they were state secrets. She learned things about him, too. A business degree from Columbia. He'd almost become a lawyer before his family situation changed. He loved Italian opera and thought modern art was a joke. His favorite meal was a pasta his mother used to make, a recipe he'd never gotten right himself. By the end of her shift, it felt like she'd known him for years, not just a couple of days. "Let me take you to dinner," he asked as she took off her apron. "Is that really a good idea?" "Probably not." but I'm finding that I just don't care. Clara knew she should refuse. Her logical side was screaming that this was insane, that she was walking into a fire, but logic had only ever brought her loneliness. There's a little Italian place a few blocks away. It's not fancy. I prefer authentic over fancy. They walked through the autumn evening, so close their shoulders would sometimes touch. Dominic's security detail was a shadow. Black cars following a half block back, but Clara hardly noticed. The restaurant was a family joint called Lucia's, run by a Neapolitan grandmother and her 3 kids. The tables had red checkered cloths, candles were stuck in old wine bottles, and the whole place smelled like garlic and baking bread. Dominic's entrance caused a ripple here too, but it was different. The owner, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes, came out and just stared at him. "Cuso," she said, her voice flat. "Mrs. Duca. My father used to eat here. I'm aware. He said your lasagna was like a taste of home." The woman's tough expression softened just a little. "Sit. I'll make you something good." They were shown to a corner table, tucked away behind a screen of fake ivy. Once they sat, Clara looked at Dominic with fresh eyes. "She knows who you are. Her husband, who has passed, worked for my father a long time ago." "Doing what exactly?" Dominic met her gaze without blinking. "Things I am not proud to talk about." Clara let that sink in. The hushed whispers at the party, the fear in people's voices, the bodyguards she was meant to ignore. It was all clicking into a picture she'd been avoiding. "You're more than just a businessman, aren't you?" "Yes. Are you going to tell me what you really are?" Dominic was silent for a second, his finger tracing the rim of his glass. "My family's been in New York for 4 generations. We built an empire from scratch, with methods the law tends to frown upon. My father ran things until he died 5 years ago. Now it's my turn." So Clara's pulse is hammering, but her eyes are locked on him, and his explanation of running it, "Oh, it's just overseeing the kind of deals you read about in tabloids. Shipping, properties, and money moves. And hey, he claims more than half of it's actually above board now. But the foundation, the very soul of the operation, that's all in the shadows." She basically asks, "So you're a crime lord?" He replies that he's the head of his family, a title that comes with a whole lot of bloody history attached. Any normal person would have been sprinting for the door. But sitting across from this guy who's dropping truth bombs instead of sweet nothings, she feels something else entirely. Respect. So why is he telling her all this? Most guys would bury this stuff. He says she deserves to know what she's walking into because his mom taught him that lying is the ultimate insult. And look, if she decides to ghost him after this, he wants it to be because of the truth, not some fantasy that was bound to implode anyway. Then Mrs. Duca shows up with food they didn't ask for, giving Clara a beat to process the bombshell. As the woman leaves, Clara grabs some bruschetta, stalling for just one more second. "You mentioned that over half your business is clean now. Is that the end game?" Dominic just nods. That's his life's mission. He wants his niece to inherit a totally legal empire when she's grown. He doesn't want her making the choices he's had to. And until that day, well, until then, he does whatever it takes to keep his family safe. He warns her that some of those things would probably make her sick, but Clara just says quietly, "I work in the ER. I've held the hands of men who have done monstrous things. I've heard them cry for their mothers. I've figured out that nobody is just one thing," and Dominic just stares at her like she just reinvented physics. "You are not at all what I pictured, Clara Bennett." And what was he picturing? Screaming, running, the usual freak out he gets from everyone. She just says, I've got enough of my own fear to deal with, and it's not my place to judge anybody. Dinner gets lighter after that, but the weight of his confession hangs in the air. Clara gets the highlight reel. Dominic's dad was a monster. His mom taught him kindness, and he had a sister who died before his niece, Isabella, was born. Little Isabella is his sister's kid, and he's all she has left. She finds out he reads philosophy to crash, is up at 5 a.m. for workouts, has never had a real vacation, and that peace for him is just letting his mom worry if he's eating right on Sundays. Then Clara starts opening up too, about the nightmares from her parents passing, the survivor's guilt that crushes her, how she buries herself in work because standing still feels like she's going to drown. By the time they leave, the sky is black velvet and the streets are dead quiet. Dominic's ride pulls up like it was summoned, but he just waves it away. Walk with me. So they wander through Brooklyn in the dark, past townhouses and corner stores, weaving through light and shadow. At some point, his hand finds hers, and this time, Clara doesn't pull away. This is a bad idea, she whispers. Yeah, he says, I really shouldn't be doing this. No, she replies, but I don't want to stop. That's when Dominic stops and turns to her. You can barely see his face in the dark, but his eyes are burning. Neither do I, he admits. And that scares me more than anything I've ever had to face. Clara reaches up, her fingers tracing his jaw. He just melts into her touch, and for a second she sees a weakness in him that probably no one else on earth ever gets to see. What do we do now? She asks. Now I do something I've never done. And what's that? I'm asking you to trust me. Not for my money or my power, but for the man I am when I'm standing here with you. I'm asking you to bet on a guy who doesn't deserve it. Clara processes everything. The confessions, the dark warnings, the gut feeling that there's more under the surface. She thinks about every red flag she should be running from. And then she thinks about how he looks at her and how he drove all the way to Brooklyn for a grilled cheese just because she was there. I trust you, she says, and she actually means it. The next few weeks are a blur, the kind of dream you're terrified to wake up from. Dominic is suddenly everywhere, showing up at the diner with her favorite coffee, grabbing her after class, sending goodnight texts she reads over and over again. He gives her a proper intro to his mother, and Mrs. Caruso hugs Clara like she's family, crying and demanding she stay for dinner. Clara ends up getting a crash course in making pasta from scratch, learning old family recipes, and finding out what it feels like to belong to something real. She meets Isabella, the little 7-year-old tornado with a killer smile who basically runs the whole Caruso operation. Isabella gives Clara her stamp of approval in about 5 minutes flat and then drags her on a tour of the entire penthouse, rambling on about school and her friend Sophie and the puppy she knows Uncle Dom is gonna get her. But watching Dominic with his niece, that's what completely wrecks Clara's heart. The fearsome man everyone whispers about just vanishes. He's on his knees, studying her crayon art like it's a masterpiece, letting her paint his fingernails hot pink, and reading her stories with silly voices that make her shriek with laughter. She loves you, Clara says later that night, after Isabella is finally asleep. He just looks at her. She's the best thing in my life, her and my mother. Everything I do is for them. And that's when it all clicks for Clara. This isn't about power or money. It's about a savage, protective love that would burn the world down for them. His world starts to make a twisted kind of sense. His men aren't loyal because they're scared. They're loyal because he earned it. He remembers their kids' birthdays, checks on their sick wives, and makes sure their families are always taken care of. His empire was born from violence, but it runs on a code of honor you rarely see in the legit world. But yeah, there were dark spots she couldn't pretend weren't there. Dominic was good at shielding her from the ugly side of his job, but Clara wasn't stupid. She saw the tense late-night calls. She saw the occasional bruises on his men that were never talked about. She felt the temperature drop when certain names were mentioned. One night, about 6 weeks in, Clara gets to the penthouse and finds Dominic in his study, staring out the window with his back to her. He's wound so tight he could snap, and his reflection in the glass is a mask of pure coldness. What's wrong? He doesn't even turn around. Nothing for you to worry about. Dominic. The way she says his name makes him face her, and she sees pure exhaustion and maybe even grief in his eyes. One of my guys got hurt tonight. Marco. He has 2 kids under 5, his wife 7 months pregnant with their third. Without a second thought, Clara goes to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, her cheek against his back. Is he going to be okay? He'll pull through. But the guys who did this, they were sending me a message. What kind of message? Dominic finally turns, pulling her into a hug. That some people want what I've got, and they'll go through anyone to get it. That's when the fear hits her, sharp and icy, but she doesn't back away. What are you gonna do? The same thing I always do. I protect my own no matter what it takes. She doesn't ask for details. She's not sure she could handle the answer, but she gets it now. Loving Dominic Caruso means accepting his world has its own set of brutal rules. She just has to figure out if she can live with them. In the days that followed, things changed. The security detail around his penthouse doubled. Dominic's calls got longer, his meetings more intense. He pushed for her to move into a guest room for her own safety, and while she argued at first, the raw fear in his eyes made her agree. Living with Dominic showed her a whole new side of him. She realized how little he slept, how the weight of it all was crushing him, how much he just wanted a single normal moment. She'd find him pacing the halls at 3 a.m. She saw him sitting by Isabella's bed for hours after she'd had a nightmare. She watched him hold his mother's hand at Sunday dinner like he was trying to memorize the feeling. And with every single crack she saw in his armor, she fell for him even harder. One sleepless night, Clara found him in the library, staring at a desk covered in old photographs. He looked up as she came in, and for once, the pain was right there in his eyes for her to see. "Who's this?" Clara asked, sinking into the chair next to him. "My father, my sister, ghosts." Her fingers traced a photo of a girl with Dominic's gaze and Isabella's grin. "She's stunning." "Valentina, 5 years my junior," he said. "The soul of this family." "What became of her?" A heavy silence filled the space. "She got involved with the wrong guy. Seemed decent, but he was pure poison underneath. By the time we saw the monster he was, she was gone." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Oh, Dominic." "I let her down. My job was to keep her safe, and I blew it. A failure I won't repeat." And right there, it all clicked for Clara. His constant check-ins, needing to know her location. It wasn't about possession. It was paralyzing fear of that kind of loss happening again. She reached for his hand. "You're not losing me." "You can't guarantee that." "I can guarantee I'm staying. Whatever is coming, we face it together." He stared at her as if she were a lifeline. Why pick this? You could have a normal life, Clara. Someone who isn't this. Someone safe." "I don't want safe," she said. "I want you, the whole package. Even the shadows you're convinced are unlovable. And then he kissed her, a soft, frantic press that said everything. For Clara, that was it. No turning back. She was walking straight into the eye of his hurricane. The following weeks were a mix of happiness and dread. Dominic, ignoring her arguments, quietly handled her tuition while she focused on school. She became woven into the lives of Mrs. Caruso and Isabella, a true part of the family, and got used to the bizarre world of a man who could discuss brutality like it was business. And she saw the vultures gathering. That hit on Marco wasn't a finale, it was an opening act. A rival outfit, run by some guy named Victor Castellaniano, was pushing hard into their turf. Clara only caught snippets of fallout from hushed, late-night talks that would go dead silent the second she walked in. She fought to keep the fear from swallowing her whole, clinging to her work and any small piece of joy she could find. But the threat loomed larger every day. Then, one afternoon, leaving the hospital, she spotted it. A black sedan across the street, definitely not one of Dominic's. Some guy was leaning on it, his gaze fixed and cold. Her first call was to Dominic. 15 minutes later, his crew materialized, hustling her into a bulletproof SUV and racing to the penthouse. Dominic was there, his face a white mask of fury. "Did he talk to you, touch you?" "No," she said. "He just stared." He yanked her into an embrace so tight it stole her breath. "This is on me. I dragged you into my life, and now you're the leverage. It's not your fault. I made my choice." "You chose me," he shot back. "You didn't sign up to be a bullseye." She pulled away, meeting his gaze. "So what's the plan?" "We finished this," he declared. "Castellaniano has been a problem long enough. It's time he learned why our family is still standing after 100 years. The chilling finality in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. But she didn't argue. She finally got it. To protect your own, sometimes you had to be the thing everyone else was afraid of. Lying next to Dominic in the pre-dawn stillness, Clara made up her mind. No matter what happened, she wasn't running. She would stand right here with him and meet any darkness that came for them head on. "All right?" Pause. "Listen up, because this is where you come in." If Clara's story has hit you at all, if you think love can bloom in the craziest places, I want you to drop a comment right now. Just type "True love knows no boundaries." Let's see how many of you think they can actually make it through this. Seriously, it matters. 3 days later, the war with Victor Castellaniano exploded. That morning was burned into Clara's memory. Golden light flooding the penthouse, the scent of Mrs. Cusso's coffee, Isabella's giggles as she performed a new dance. It was all so damn normal. So peaceful, Clara almost let herself believe the worst was over. And that's always a mistake, isn't it? Then his phone buzzed. She saw the blood drain from his face as he took the call, his grip on the phone turning his knuckles bone white. "When?" A beat. "How many?" He hung up, standing there like a sculpture of pure rage. "What is it?" Clara whispered. "Castellaniano just made his play. Hit 3 warehouses. 12 of my guys are down." He looked at her, and beneath the fury, she saw it. Terror. And he sent something else. Pictures of her, leaving the hospital at the diner in the park. "He's been tracking your every move." The world just fell away beneath Clara's feet. "What's his endgame?" "Everything. My turf. My operation. He figures using you as a threat makes me vulnerable." "Does it?" she asked. In 2 steps, he was in front of her, his hands framing her face. "It makes me more lethal than he could ever comprehend." "You don't threaten my family, ever." The next few days were a tense, chaotic blur. Clara was locked down in the penthouse, movements tracked, guarded around the clock. She hated the cage but knew why it was necessary. Dominic was a ghost, appearing at all hours, looking more wrecked each time, so she did what she could. She soothed Mrs. Caruso. Caruso, who was deep in prayer to saints Clara had never heard of. She kept Isabella occupied with stories, protecting her from the poison of fear in the air. She forced Dominic to eat, to rest, to feel her support when there was nothing to say. Then, on night 4, he appeared in her doorway after midnight. His shirt was ripped, his knuckles were raw, and a gash over his eye kicked her nurse instincts into high gear. "Sit," she commanded, grabbing the first aid kit from her nightstand. He obeyed, sitting on the bed, utterly still while she patched him up. After she was done, he gently took her wrist. "I'm not good enough for you." "Not your call to make," she said back. "Listen, if this goes wrong, you take Isabella and my mother. Everything's arranged. Money, a safe place. You'll be set." "Nothing's going to happen." "You can't know that." "I know I refuse to entertain a future that you're not in." He pulled her onto his lap, hiding his face against her throat. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "You had a party," she murmured. "I crashed it, and now we're here." He let out a broken laugh that was almost a sob. She just held on, trying to pull his agony into herself. "Just tell me we make it through this," she whispered. "We make it through this," he promised. "And when we do, I'm marrying you, Clara Bennett, in a real church. My mother will weep, Isabella will be the flower girl. You will be my wife, and I'll spend forever trying to be worthy of you." Tears streamed down her face. "Is that you asking?" "It's me promising. The real proposal happens when I have a proper ring, when I can get on one knee and not worry about assassins." "I don't care about a ring." "I do. You'll have it all. I promise." They just held on, building a future with words, hoping it would be enough. So he told her his dreams: 4 kids, a big house upstate with horses, massive Sunday dinners. She shared hers: a free clinic for the poor, getting old together, fighting over who had to cook, and watching grandkids play in her own garden. It was a whole life, built in a single night. By sunrise, they'd mapped out an entire existence, and they were both dead set on surviving to see it. 2 days later, it all went down with Castellaniano. Clara wasn't there, but she heard the story in bits and pieces later. Dominic set up a meet, a supposed negotiation, but Victor wasn't there to parley. He showed up with guns and a plan to wipe the Carusos off the map for good. But here's the kicker: he never factored in the loyalty Dominic commands. Castellaniano's own crew flipped on him. Moles Dominic had in place for months, just waiting for the signal. It was quick, it was clean. Victor Castellaniano was taken down and delivered to some federal contacts Dominic kept on speed dial. A mountain of evidence gathered over years meant he was going away for a very long time. It was finished. Dominic walked in that night without a mark on him, but Clara saw the war he'd just won etched deep in his eyes. For hours, he just sat in the library, his gaze fixed on absolutely nothing. When she finally coaxed him to bed, he clung to her like she was the only anchor in a world that wouldn't stop spinning. "It's over," he finally whispered. "Castellana is never going to hurt anyone ever again." "And how are you?" He actually thought about it. A mix of relief, exhaustion, and a new kind of fire. "I'm ready to build something from the wreckage, to be the guy you see in me, to give my niece something to be proud of." Clara Ara traced kisses over his face, a soft answer to his hard promises. "You're already him. You just have to see it." And in the weeks that came next, Clara saw Dominic change. With Castellano permanently out of the picture, he dove into making his empire legitimate with a vengeance. Deals that were stuck in limbo suddenly pushed through. Alliances with clean enterprises started to multiply. The whole operation began crawling out of the shadows and into the sunlight. And of course, Mrs. Caruso started plotting a wedding no one had announced, leaving bridal magazines everywhere like tactical breadcrumbs. Isabella officially declared herself the flower girl and began daily rehearsals, usually with the family cat as a very unwilling ring bearer. And Clara, for the first time she could remember, was genuinely, completely happy. She aced her nursing program, with Dominic and his crew cheering like maniacs in the crowd. She landed her dream job at a health clinic in the Bronx, finally doing the work she was meant to do. She officially moved into his penthouse, turning a spare room into a small office for her patient charts and research. Life settled into a beautiful, normal rhythm. They had Sunday dinners with Mrs. Caruso, who always cooked for an army and chewed out Dominic for being a workaholic. Weekends were for taking Isabella to Central Park, letting her tear through piles of leaves and terrorize pigeons. They would stay up all night talking, learning the tiny, intimate details about each other. Then one night, 3 months after Castellano was gone, Dominic got home early, practically bouncing. "I've got something for you." He drove her out of the city, deep into Westchester, where the trees were on fire with autumn colors. After winding down a series of back roads, they pulled up to a gate. Behind it stood a stone house wrapped in ivy, with a garden that seemed to stretch on forever. "What is this?" "It's our home," he said, "if you'll have it." Clara just stared, her eyes flicking from him to the house and back again. "You bought a house. I bought us a future, a place to raise kids, where my mom can finally have her garden, where Isabella can get that dog she won't shut up about." Clara drifted out of the car towards the house, completely stunned. It was the exact place she'd described to him during all those late-night whispered conversations. A sprawling, warm house with real character, surrounded by enough land for horses and trees that looked ancient. Dominic trailed her, his face a mask of nervous hope. "We don't have to keep it. If it's not right, we'll find another one." Clara spun around, tears pouring down her cheeks. "It's perfect." "It is absolutely perfect." He broke into that huge, unguarded smile she loved so much. "Then there's just one more thing." And he dropped to one knee. Clara's hands flew to her mouth as Dominic produced a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, a single perfect diamond that shattered the dying sunlight into 1,000 tiny rainbows. "Clara Bennett," he started. "You came into my life on a night when I had everything but was completely empty. You looked past the reputation and found the man I'd forgotten how to be. You gave me hope, you gave my family joy, and you gave my heart a place to belong." His voice broke and he had to stop for a second. "I am not a good man. I've done things that would make most people run. But I swear to you, I will spend every day for the rest of my life trying to deserve you. Will you marry me?" Clara dropped to her knees right there in front of him, cradling his face in her hands. And right on cue, 1,000 times yes. He slips the ring on her finger, they kneel in the grass, and the sun dips behind the house that was supposed to be their home. That kiss tasted of joy, a promise, and the sweet, stupid lie that some stories actually get a happy ending. Their May wedding was just the beginning of the end. The Westchester estate was a perfect stage, all white roses and golden light. Clara drifted down the aisle in a simple gown, feeling like royalty heading toward the very man who would ruin everything. Dominic stood at the altar, leaking tears for the whole world to see, completely oblivious to the real reason he should be crying. His mother was a mess in the front row, sobbing into a handkerchief. Isabella took her flower girl job dead seriously, scattering petals with the focus of a bomb disposal expert. The ceremony itself was short and powerful. They read their own vows, promises to be partners, to be patient, to laugh, and to build a life that honored the darkness they'd fought through and the light they'd found. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the cheer from the crowd felt like it could shake the leaves from the trees. Dominic kissed Clara like the world was simultaneously ending and just beginning, and she kissed him right back, fierce and unapologetic. The reception was a full-blown Caruso dream. Food for days, music that made everyone dance, and toasts that were equal parts hilarious and heartbreaking. Clara danced with her new husband, with his mom, and with little Isabella, who stood on her feet and shrieked with laughter. Later that night, when things quieted down, Clara stole a moment alone on the terrace. The moonlight lit up the garden, and for a second, she just breathed it all in. Dominic found her there, because of course he did. "Mrs. Caruso," he murmured, wrapping her in his arms. "How's it feel?" "Like a dream I'm terrified to wake up from." "Then we stay asleep." They stood there for a while, just watching the stars pop out. "I was thinking," Dominic said after a bit, "about what's next. We've got a lot of next to think about. I want to speed things up. Get out of the last of the shadow businesses in a year, not 5. I want to be completely clean before our first kid is born." Clara turned to face him. "Our first child? Unless you're against the idea." A tiny secret smile played on her lips. "Funny you should say that. We might have to move that timeline up." Dominic went completely rigid. "Clara, I was going to tell you tomorrow, do something romantic, but I can't hold it in." She took his hand, pressing it flat against her stomach. "You're going to be a father." For a long beat, Dominic was just a statue. Then his face just crumpled and he crushed her in a hug. "Are you sure?" "Got it confirmed yesterday, about 8 weeks." He pulled back, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "A baby? Our baby?" "Our baby." He let out a wild, joyful laugh and spun her around until she was dizzy, clinging to his shoulders. When he finally put her down, the words started spilling out. "We need the best doctors, we need to gut the nursery, we need more security, and we have to tell my mother right now, because she will actually murder us if she finds out we knew at the wedding." "Dominic, and the business timeline, we should move it to 6 months. Isabella is going to lose her mind. She's been asking for a baby since she found out how they're made, which, by the way, was a super fun talk." "Dominic." He finally stopped and looked at her. "Breathe," she said softly. "We have time, so much time." He let out a long breath, a boyish wonder on his face. "I love you, Clara, more than anything." "I love you too. Now let's go tell your mother before her superpower kicks in, and she just knows." Mrs. Caruso's reaction was predictable chaos. Tears, prayers, and a flurry of calls to every relative on the eastern seaboard. Isabella's was even better, a scream of pure joy, followed by a list of completely unacceptable baby names. The pregnancy flew by in a happy, chaotic blur. Clara worked at the clinic into her 7th month, only stopping when Dominic's nonstop worrying became too much to handle. They finished the Westchester house, creating a nursery with soft yellow walls and an absurd number of stuffed animals. And Dominic made good on his word. By the time Clara Ara hit her third trimester, the last of the family's illicit businesses were either sold off or shut down. For the first time in a century, the Caruso empire was totally legit. It was a miracle that had seemed absolutely impossible when they'd first met. But love, as it turns out, has a funny way of making miracles happen. Their daughter arrived on a snowy morning in December with Dominic holding Clara's hand through every single second. She was perfect, a tiny, warm little thing with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin. So they slapped the name Valentina on the kid, a tribute to Dominic's dead sister. Predictably, Mrs. Caruso just loses it for hours. Bringing the baby to the Westchester Fortress is meant to feel like the final puzzle piece clicking into place. And there's Clara Ara holding her daughter by a snowy window, absolutely stunned by her own come-up. Let's rewind a year and a half. She was a nobody, a wallflower at some rich kid party. Now, she's a wife and mother, absorbed by a family that went all in on her just as she did for them. Dominic shows up, fresh from wrestling his mom into taking a nap. He's like, "She's out cold, but trust me, your mother was ready for another hour. My mother would hold her until she turned to dust if we'd let her." He comes over, wraps his arms around both of them, and for a second, they're a bubble of warmth in the middle of winter. Then he whispers, "Thank you." "For what?" "For this," he says. "This whole life I never even thought was on the table." Clara just melts into him, feeling his heartbeat. "We did this together," she says. And they just stand there while the snow piles up and the house goes dead quiet. Outside, the world is still a garbage fire of chaos and pain and whatever. But right here, in this little bubble, it's just them and the fantasy of a perfect future. Fast forward 5 years. The Westchester prison has somehow become a place filled with actual joy. Valentina's a little firecracker, all her dad's intensity mixed with her mom's bleeding heart, running the show just like Isabella used to. Isabella, by the way, is 12 now, deep in the teenage drama swamp, which is honestly pretty hilarious for everyone else. Mrs. Caruso has bailed to the guest house. She's close enough to shower the grandkids with gifts, but far enough to keep her sanity. She finally got that garden she wanted, and it's exploded into this insane jungle of color and smells that brings her a ridiculous amount of joy. Clara Ara opened her clinic, but get this, not in the Bronx. She picked some other desperate town that needed a hero. She hired a whole team and built this thing from the ground up that she's genuinely proud of, a place that patches people up whether they're broke or not. And Dominic? He's become a guy even he wouldn't recognize. The legit empire he built now has thousands of employees and funnels millions into charities. He's on hospital boards, for crying out loud. His name now means philanthropist, not guy who will break your legs. The terrified whispers that followed him are gone, replaced by a kind of grudging respect he actually earned. But let's be real, he's still the same guy who would burn the world down for her. That terrifying devotion that got her hooked is still there. On their 5th anniversary, Clara wakes up and he's already at the window, watching the sunrise like he's in a movie. She slides her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" "That party," he says. "The way you almost bolted." "I did bolt. You stopped me." "And if I hadn't?" She actually thinks about it. "I'd have gone back to my shoebox apartment, nuked some leftovers, and passed out to old TV shows. I would have died never knowing what I was missing." Dominic turns to her, and the whole tough guy act just melts away. "I'd have found you," he says, dead serious. "Our paths were going to cross again." "You can't know that." "I can, because some people are just inevitable, no matter how lost they get." They're programmed to find their way back to each other. She smiles and gets on her toes to kiss him. Happy anniversary, husband. Happy anniversary, wife. Their big party is just a quiet dinner. The whole crew is there. Mrs. Caruso makes her legendary lasagna. Isabella busts out a scrapbook she secretly made, full of pictures chronicling their entire weird relationship. Valentina belts out a school song, completely off-key, and gets a standing ovation for it. Later, once the kids are down and the house is finally quiet, they take a walk through the moonlit garden. The whole place smells like roses, and fireflies are blinking everywhere like scattered diamonds. You ever miss it? Clara Ara asks. The power, the influence? Not for a second, he says. The power I have now is real. It's sleeping at night. It's looking my kids in the eye. It's knowing I built something that will actually last. There's no contest. She squeezes his hand. I'm proud of you, she says. Of us. This thing we built is more than I ever let myself imagine. They end up on a bench under an old oak tree, the exact same spot from their first night here, when their future felt like a dangerous, blindingly bright dream. Okay, hit me with the next 5 years, she says. Dominic actually smiles, that real smile he saves just for her. Valentina starts school, probably stages a coup in the first week. Isabella gets her license and becomes a menace to public safety. My mother finishes her cookbook and strong-arms us into publishing it. Your clinic will probably need a second location. And us? We just get older. We'll fight over stupid stuff and be a team on the big stuff. We'll watch our kids grow up. There will be good days, hard days, and a whole lot of boring days that end up being the ones that matter most. Clara Ara feels tears welling up, not of sadness, but because it's all so goddamn perfect. I want that. All of it. Then it's ours. They just sit there in the silence. A light flickers in the house. Isabella probably raiding the fridge. An owl hoots somewhere out in the dark. The world just keeps spinning, not caring about them at all, which is both terrifying and beautiful. Clara Ara thinks about who she was, that invisible girl at a party who knew she didn't belong. She thinks about the insane chain of events that led her here, the choices and risks she never knew she had the guts to make. And she thinks about the man next to her, who saw her when she was basically a ghost. Thank you, she whispers. Dominic looks over. For what? For seeing me, that first night. When I was just part of the wallpaper, you saw me. How could I not? You were the only real person in a room full of fakes, the only one not wearing a mask. I was so scared. I know, I saw you shaking, and I saw you lift your chin anyway. I watched you refuse to be broken. That's when I knew. Knew what? That you were the one, the person I'd been waiting for my whole damn life. Clara Ara turns and grabs his hands. I love you, Dominic Caruso. I loved you when you were dangerous, and I love you now that you're safe. I'll love you when we're old and can't find our glasses. I'll love you forever. Forever's a long time. Not long enough. He kisses her, a deep, tender kiss that's like signing the contract all over again under the moonlight. And as they walk back to the house, she knows deep in her bones, this is it. This is home. The story that kicked off with a girl no one could see ended with a love so bright it was basically a spotlight. The woman who ran from the party found the one thing money can't buy. And the man who built an empire in the dark learned that real power is just being seen and loved for the mess you actually are. They didn't live happily ever after because that's a fairy tale lie. They lived fully, with all the chaos and screw-ups and tiny miracles that make up a life, with fights that ended in laughter and challenges that made them tougher. They lived and loved and built something that would matter long after they were gone. Right? If you're still watching, you're clearly invested in this train wreck. Do me a favor and drop a comment saying, I watched this far, so I know who the real ones are. Your engagement is everything to me. It pushes these stories out to more people. If this hit you in the feels, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe in weird connections. And if you haven't, for God's sake, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for sticking with me on this journey. Until next time, remember, sometimes the craziest love story starts when someone finally actually sees you